I came to fix a broken window, but I never expected she would be the one to quietly pull me into her world, closing the curtains and opening something in my heart I didn't know was still alive. I never thought a small window repair job on a Thursday afternoon would lead me anywhere unexpected. It was just another address scribbled on my clipboard. Elena Voss, 27 Willow Lane. But the moment I stepped out of my van, I felt something different about the place. A narrow brick townhouse, surrounded by a modest garden where jasmine climbed the fence and filled the air with gentle sweetness. Felt lived in, carefully tended, but quiet. Too quiet. I knocked. A few seconds passed before the door opened, and that's when I saw her. Elena. She looked to be in her early 40s, the kind of woman who didn't need to say much for you to feel her presence. Her dark hair was loosely gathered behind her head, a few strands falling forward like they were claiming the right to soften her features. She wore a soft cream sweater and dark jeans. Nothing dramatic, but the confidence in the way she carried herself made the simplest clothing look elegant. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice warm but edged with something nervous. She stepped aside to let me in. As I passed her, I caught a subtle scent. Jasmine again, but warmer, like it had soaked into her skin. Inside, her home felt like an extension of her. Soft colors, framed paintings along the walls, shelves that held books rather than dust. It was beautiful, but a certain emptiness lingered beneath it all, like someone had left suddenly, taking laughter with them. "The window is upstairs," she said, leading the way. As we climbed the staircase, she kept glancing back at me. Not flirtatious. More as if she was making sure I was really there. Present. Real. The window in question sat in the upstairs sitting room, overlooking the street. One pane was cracked, and the frame had loosened enough to let cool drafts sneak through. I set my tools down, rolled up my sleeves, and climbed onto the small step ladder she'd already placed there. She hovered nearby, not in a bothersome way, but close enough that I could sense her attention on every movement I made. When the ladder wobbled slightly on the rug, her hand instinctively shot out to steady it, and her fingers grazed the small of my back. It was a split-second touch, barely pressure at all, but it sent a surprising warmth through me. "Sorry," she murmured, stepping back, eyes dropping for a moment. A faint flush colored her cheeks. "It's all right," I replied, trying to sound casual while my heartbeat worked on a different agenda. We settled into a quiet rhythm, me working, her nearby. Occasionally she'd ask if I needed water or better lighting or anything at all. But every time she spoke, I noticed the lingering hesitations. Like kindness had recently become something she wasn't sure she was allowed to offer. There was something about her restraint, the way she folded her arms protectively across her chest, the way she glanced toward the window as if it connected her to a world she no longer felt part of, that made me want to look deeper. It was just a simple job. But already, I could tell this wasn't going to be just another afternoon. The late afternoon sun filtered through the cracked pane, scattering light in fractured shapes across the room. From the top of the ladder, I could see the neighborhood outside. Quiet street, neighbors walking their dogs, a couple of kids riding bikes. Normal life. Simple. But inside this room, the air felt different, quieter, heavier, like the space between us carried its own kind of tension. I adjusted a screw, leaning slightly outward to test the frame. That's when I sensed her behind me. Close. Closer than before. Her steps were soft, but the warmth of her presence gave her away before she even spoke. Without warning, she reached up and drew the curtains together, the fabric whispering as it slid along the rail. The room shifted into a soft dusk, dim, private, almost secretive. The sunlight vanished, replaced by an amber glow from the lamp in the corner. Her movements were careful, but her hands hesitated a moment longer than necessary on the curtain edges, fingers brushing against my arm as she lowered her hands. A light touch, but enough to make my pulse pause. I looked down at her, puzzled and curious. She caught my glance and immediately looked away, her voice barely above a hush. I don't like the neighbors watching." There was a tremor in her tone. Not fear, exactly. More like discomfort etched from too many eyes noticing things she wished they wouldn't. Or maybe too many judging them. That's okay, I said gently. Privacy's important. She exhaled slowly, relief mixed with embarrassment. Then she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, but her hand kept going, smoothing her sweater as if trying to hide the vulnerability that had slipped out. I lowered myself a couple rungs down the ladder until our eyes met on the same level. In the softened light, she looked different. Less guarded, more human. Her lashes fluttered as she tried to gather her composure. I know it probably sounds silly, she murmured. It's just been a strange year. Her fingers played with the hem of her sleeve, a small restless motion that spoke louder than her words. She wasn't used to explaining herself, and she wasn't used to someone listening. It doesn't sound silly, I replied. Not to me. Her eyes lifted to mine again, searching, wary, but hopeful. And for a heartbeat we just stood there, close enough that I could feel the softest brush of her breath against my chest. She stepped back a fraction, like she'd just realized how near she'd drifted. But she didn't apologize this time. She just let the silence speak. Outside, the world continued on. Cars passing, laughter echoing faintly down the street. Unaware of the quiet shift happening behind drawn curtains, I returned to the window, hands steady but thoughts anything but. There was more to Elena than polite smiles and a cracked pane of glass. Something deeper waited beneath the surface. Something she was trying to protect, or maybe afraid to want. Either way, the curtains weren't the only thing she had just closed. She had shut the world out, and whether she meant to or not, she had let me in. I tightened the last screw in the window frame and stepped carefully down from the ladder. The dim room felt warmer now, as if the curtain-drawn silence had wrapped around us like a shared secret. Elena stood nearby with her arms lightly crossed, fingertips brushing her elbows. A subtle self-embrace. She watched me, but her gaze would flick away whenever I tried to meet it fully, like she wanted to be seen, but wasn't sure she deserved the attention. Almost done, I said, breaking the quiet. She nodded, attempting a smile. It didn't quite reach her eyes. I could have left it there, kept things professional, stayed in my lane. But something in her expression tugged at me, a small tightening around her mouth that looked like she was holding back words with weight. Are you okay? I asked. She blinked, caught off guard. Her fingers stilled on her sleeves. I'm fine, she replied automatically. Too quickly. Then she sighed, soft but heavy. Sorry. I'm not very good at pretending, am I? Her vulnerability came not as a confession, but as surrender. She looked at me then, really looked, as though she was trying to decide how much of her story to reveal to a near stranger with a toolbox. You don't have to tell me anything, I added gently. But I'm here, and I'm listening. She took a step toward the window, toward me, and rested her fingertips along the edge of the repaired frame. Her nails traced absent shapes in the wood. My husband left earlier this year, she said quietly, voice steady but fragile around the edges. We spent so long drifting apart that by the time he walked out the door, it almost felt like a relief. But the silence afterward, she swallowed, eyes shining. The silence has been unbearable. I didn't speak. I didn't rush to fix anything. Not this time. I just stood close enough that she could feel another heartbeat in the room besides her own. He always complained that I cared too much what others thought, she continued. And maybe he was right. I'm constantly worried about how I come across, that people will judge me, misunderstand me. Her voice wavered. Or worse, not notice me at all. The dim light caught the delicate lines beneath her eyes, not from age, but from courage stretched thin. Without really thinking, I reached out and gently touched her forearm. Just below the sleeve, the warmth of her skin immediate against my fingertips. She didn't flinch. In fact, she leaned into the touch almost imperceptibly. Her tension softened, shoulders lowering as though some invisible weight had shifted. No one could overlook you, I said, my voice rougher than I intended. Not if they were really paying attention. Her breath hitched, the kind of breath someone takes when they've been holding themselves together for too long. She turned slightly toward me, her eyes searching mine, disbelief and gratitude mingling in a way that felt achingly intimate. "Thank you," she whispered. That single word felt more personal than any long confession. In that moment, it wasn't just a window that had been repaired. Something in her had finally, cautiously, begun to open. I moved the ladder aside and knelt to make one final adjustment at the bottom of the frame. The repair wasn't complicated, but somehow I found myself taking my time. Not rushing meant staying here a little longer. Staying near her. "Elena," I said gently, "would you mind holding the frame from this side? Just while I tighten this last bolt." She stepped closer, nodding, and positioned her hands along the wood. The tips of her fingers rested just inches from mine. For a moment we worked quietly, but the silence felt less heavy now, like a calm breath shared between two people learning how to trust the air again. As I reached up to secure the final piece, my knuckles brushed against her skin. Warm, delicate, but steady, more steady than she felt inside, I could tell. She didn't pull back. Instead, her hand stilled under mine. Our fingertips met, just touch at first, then a soft, almost curious shift. Her thumb slid lightly against my knuckle, a slow, intentional stroke, the kind someone might not dare put into words. I felt heat rise up the back of my neck. Not from embarrassment, from the sudden, undeniable realization that this wasn't one-sided. Whatever tension I'd been quietly wrestling with, she felt it too. My breath deepened. I could hear hers, gentle but unsteady, as if every inhale was a question she was afraid to ask. We froze like that, connected by the smallest point of touch, but it carried the weight of everything unspoken. Trust, loneliness, a longing neither of us had planned on. When I looked up at her, she was already looking at me. Her eyes weren't guarded now. They were open, searching, trying to figure out if what she was feeling was allowed. If we were allowed. "Sorry," she whispered, but her hand still rested beneath mine. "You don't have to apologize for anything," I replied quietly. "Not to me." A soft, surprised breath escaped her, almost like relief. She stepped closer, guided by feeling more than thought, until the distance between us was filled only by warmth and the closeness of shared gravity. Time felt like it slowed into something gentler. The world outside those curtains seemed far away, busy, indifferent, unaware of how lives can shift in a single heartbeat. The frame didn't need her support anymore, but she didn't move, and neither did I. Her hand, still under mine, squeezed, a subtle promise, a tiny act of courage, and a message: don't step away, not yet. The lamp's glow softened the shadows around her face, tracing the curve of her cheek and the quiet vulnerability in her smile. And suddenly, fixing a window felt like the least important reason to be there. Her fingers curled slightly, holding on, and without needing any words at all, I held back. I was adjusting the final hinge screw when the slightest shift in balance caught me off guard. Just a small tilt, the kind that would normally be nothing more than an awkward stumble. But the moment my foot slipped from the rung of the ladder, Elena reacted faster than I could think. Her hand caught my forearm firmly, fingers wrapping around the muscle just below my elbow. Her other hand steadied my shoulder as I instinctively leaned forward. In a blink, the tension inside my chest wasn't from falling. It was from suddenly being held by her. My boots found the floor again, but neither of us stepped away. Instead, I found myself standing between her arms, close enough that the soft fabric of her sweater brushed against my shirt, close enough that the light scent of jasmine was no longer something floating in the room. It was her, breathing beside me. Her chest rose and fell against mine, an uneven breath she hadn't meant to share. "You're safe," she murmured, voice low, a rasp of concern threaded with something far more delicate. She looked up at me, and our eyes locked. Too long to be accidental, too full of meaning to ignore. The inches between us felt charged, as though the entire room was holding its breath for us. I could feel the warmth of her hands like a quiet fire spreading through my skin. Her palms lingered longer than necessary, but not long enough for what my heart suddenly wanted. "I thought you were going to fall," she added, her tone softening into a vulnerable confession. "I think you caught me before I even realized." I replied. A small, nervous laugh escaped her. Almost a release of tension she hadn't realized she was holding. But as the laughter faded, what remained was different. Her gaze drifted to my mouth for the briefest second, then returned to my eyes. A fleeting moment that said everything we were too careful to say aloud. We stood like that, close, suspended, as though either movement might break whatever fragile, beautiful thing had just formed between us. I could feel her hands soften, sliding slowly down my arms until her fingertips rested lightly near my wrists. The slightest shift, but meaningful. A touch that wasn't about catching me anymore. It was about not wanting to let go. Her breath brushed the side of my neck as she spoke, barely above a whisper. I don't know the last time someone was this close. I swallowed, trying to steady my own voice. Then maybe we should stay like this a moment. Her lips parted, not to speak, but in surprise, and perhaps quiet agreement. Her eyes softened with gratitude, with longing, with a spark of hope so fragile it felt like it needed to be protected. At last, she stepped back. Only a small step, but her hands slid away reluctantly, fingertips trailing along my skin until they reluctantly parted. The latter was steady now, but I wasn't sure I was. The room had changed, or maybe we had, and as I took a slow breath, heart racing, I realized this wasn't about fixing a window anymore. This was about two people who had been breaking quietly, finding something in each other that refused to stay in pieces. The window sat perfectly in its frame now, solid and whole, as if it had never been broken. I stepped back, wiped a smudge of dust from my hands, and finally allowed myself to look at her fully. Elena was standing a few feet away, her posture relaxed now, though her hands still fidgeted lightly with the edge of her sweater. There was a pause, a moment of quiet that stretched just long enough to feel intimate, as if the world had softened around us. The sunlight filtering through the drawn curtains cast a warm amber glow across the room, highlighting the gentle lines of her face, the way her hair fell just so around her shoulders. It was the kind of light that makes ordinary things look extraordinary, and somehow, she seemed to belong entirely in it. Would you like some tea?" she asked, her voice calm but tinged with hesitation. Not an ordinary offer, it was more of an invitation, a gentle nudge to linger rather than leave. I smiled. "I'd like that." She led me to the small sitting area, the soft carpet muffling our footsteps. We sat down on the sofa, just close enough that our knees brushed under the low coffee table. The proximity was small, almost accidental, but the awareness it stirred between us was unmistakable. The clink of teacups filled the quiet. She poured first, hand steady, then offered me mine. Our fingers brushed in the exchange, lingering a fraction longer than necessary. It was subtle, almost shy, yet it sent a warmth spreading from my chest to my fingertips. We sipped quietly at first, neither wanting to break the fragile intimacy that had begun to form. Then, slowly, the conversation started to flow. She spoke about her mornings now, the walks she took alone, the quiet rituals she had developed to keep the loneliness at bay. I listened, genuinely intrigued, noticing the small, telling gestures. The curl of her fingers around the cup, the way her shoulders relaxed when she felt comfortable, the occasional fleeting glance at me that lingered just a second too long. "I forget what it feels like to be noticed," she admitted softly. "To feel like someone truly sees me, without expectation or judgment." Her words struck me, and before I could stop myself, my hand moved. Gently, I reached across the space between us and brushed her fingers with mine. The contact was fleeting, just a touch, but her fingers stayed intertwined with mine longer than I expected. A silent acknowledgement passed between us. A quiet recognition that we were both craving connection, closeness, understanding. I swallowed, unsure if words were necessary. "Then maybe that's what today's been about," I said softly. "Not just fixing the window." Her lips curved into a small, almost shy smile. She looked down at our hands, then back at me. "Maybe you're right," she whispered. The light shifted in the room, illuminating her profile. I noticed the subtle tension in her jaw relax, the faint tilt of her head as she leaned slightly closer. She didn't move away when our knees brushed again. Instead, she let it be, a quiet surrender to proximity and comfort. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she didn't seem guarded. She didn't seem alone. And as I watched her sip her tea, the small, serene smile tugging at her lips, I realized that neither of us wanted the moment to end. Something gentle, tender, and unspoken was taking root between us, delicate as sunlight through the drawn curtains, yet impossible to ignore. The window stood flawless now, and the teacups sat empty on the low table between us. There was a lingering warmth in the room, not from the sunlight, but from something more intimate, the quiet closeness that had grown over the past hour. Elena moved toward the door, a small, deliberate movement that made my chest tighten. I followed, partly because it felt natural, partly because I didn't want the afternoon, this delicate unfolding of connection, to end. She stopped just inside the doorway, turning to face me fully. Her hair had fallen loosely now, framing her face in soft waves, and the light from the hallway caught the warmth in her eyes. She reached out, almost instinctively, to smooth the collar of my shirt. Her fingers brushed my shoulder and lingered, as if reluctant to pull away. It was a small, quiet gesture, intimate but entirely safe, yet it carried the weight of everything we hadn't said aloud. "Thank you for staying," she said softly. Her voice held a vulnerability that was no longer hidden, a trust she hadn't extended to anyone in a long time. "I didn't want to leave," I admitted, my voice low. "Not today." For a moment, we just stood there, hands brushing, breaths mingling, caught in that fragile space where words weren't necessary. The world outside the curtains could wait. The quiet hum of life beyond the walls of her townhouse, the distant chatter, the passing cars, felt irrelevant. "I don't usually do this," she murmured, almost apologetically. "Invite someone in like this." Her gaze dropped briefly, then lifted again, soft and certain. "But I'm glad I did." I smiled, stepping slightly closer, careful not to crowd her, letting the warmth of proximity speak where words could not. "I'm glad I came," I replied. "More than I expected to be." The curtains were still drawn, enclosing us in the amber glow of the room. She moved to pull them back, but this time I didn't step away. Instead, I watched as the light spilled into the room, illuminating her in a way that made the ordinary extraordinary. Sunlight caught her hair, glinting gold and chestnut, highlighting the quiet strength in her posture, the gentle curve of her smile. We stood side by side, close enough to feel the subtle warmth of each other's bodies, comfortable enough that the world outside could exist without intruding. And in that quiet moment, I realized something simple and profound. She had invited me not just to fix a window, but to witness her world, her vulnerability, and perhaps her heart. "Can I come back?" I asked softly. "To check the window? Or maybe just check on you?" Her lips curved into a slow, serene smile. "I'd like that very much," she said, and her hand brushed mine in a deliberate, gentle touch, a quiet promise. As we stepped into the sunlight together, side by side, I felt a calm certainty that whatever had started with a cracked window had transformed into something far more enduring. Two hearts, once lonely, now finding each other in the warmth of quiet moments, gestures, and unspoken trust. The curtains hung open now, framing a room that no longer felt lonely. And as I looked at her, the faint, hopeful light in her eyes mirrored my own. For the first time in a long time, both of us were home. As the sunlight filled the room, and they stood there, side by side, it was clear some connections are worth waiting for, and worth noticing. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more slow burn, age gap romances. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced a quiet moment that changed everything? I'd love to hear your story.